Hey everyone, Scott here. I have a special announcement before we begin this episode. I'm doing a 5-part series on the Middle Ages, and I make the argument that the so-called Dark Ages really weren't that dark. No one thought the Earth was flat. Many things were invented like clocks, windmills, and even flying machines. Universities were built, philosophy spread, and even the bad stuff that we associate with the Middle Ages, like witch burnings, happened in the Renaissance and even the Enlightenment. The reason I'm doing this series is because I'm also releasing a book that I just finished on the same subject. It's called The Age of Illumination: Science, Technology, and Reason in the Middle Ages. It covers all the things I'm going to mention in this podcast series, but goes into way more detail. The book is now available on Amazon in ebook and paperback form. I'm running 2 special promotions for History Unplugged listeners to launch this book. First, I'm giving away free ebook copies for the first 10 people who leave a review for the History Unplugged podcast on iTunes. All you have to do is leave a review, then email me the screen name under which you left the review. You can email that to me at info@historyonthenet.com. Second, I'm discounting the ebook to only 99 cents during launch week, which is February 18th to the 22nd. After that, the ebook will still be only $2.99. You can find the book by going to Amazon and searching for The Age of Illumination and Scott Rank. So if you like this podcast, I think you'll really like the book. I get way into the details of the Middle Ages and try to make the story as interesting as possible. So please go check it out on Amazon. And if you like the book, please leave a review as well. Thanks for listening. Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hey everyone, welcome back to our series on a revisionist account of the Middle Ages. Looking into what I think is the most misunderstood period in history. Many think of it as a time when society was treading water between the fall of the Roman Empire and the Renaissance. But really, as I talked about in the last episode, a lot of the foundations for the modern world were laid at this time. In the last episode, we talked about the fall of the Roman Empire and what the beginning of the Middle Ages actually meant. We also looked at the person of Charlemagne, and how you see Western society recover from the fall of Rome, not just in the 1400s or 1500s, but well back into the 8th or 9th centuries. In this episode, we're going to look at a few institutions that I think for good reason have a really bad reputation, including Catholic Indulgences, the Crusades, and the militaristic monastic order, the Knights Templar. Now, I'm not going to argue in favor of any of these institutions because many of them do have a bad reputation for very good reason. Going on an armed mission against people of another religion is never that great. But like other things in this series, what I want to do is just move away from this black and white binary where something is either completely good or completely bad and explore the nuance. For example, Catholic indulgences are thought of a practice where the church uses its moral authority to exploit Catholics and the poor and extort them out of money. Now, many of the practices were disreputable, but there's some interesting effects that come about due to indulgences. For example, Johannes Gutenberg didn't immediately start running out and printing Bibles when he perfected the movable type printing press. Many of his earliest orders, along with many other printers, were Catholic indulgences. So it's these unintended consequences and surprisingly positive effects jumping out of something that could be seen as negative is what I want to explore in this episode. So let's start out with indulgences. What is an indulgence? If we're looking at the official definition, which I found in the Catholic Encyclopedia, indulgence is the remission of the temporal punishment due to sin that has been forgiven and is exercised of the Church's authority to bind it loose. Okay, what does that mean? To strip away some of the theological language, there's a mortal effect of sin that can only be removed by confession. But there's still a lasting effect of sin, even if you receive the confession and you're absolved by the church, that has to be dealt with, and typically you could only deal with it by purgatory. Let me give you an example of what I mean and what an indulgence can do for you if you purchase one in the Middle Ages. Let's say you're in middle school, you're playing baseball with your friends, you hit a baseball, and you break a neighbor's window. You can go to the neighbor and apologize, and they'll accept your apology, but you still might have to pay them for the window. That paying money for the window is the temporal sin, the effects that linger on that still have to be cleared up by the action of your sin. The neighbor can forgive you, and that's what the confessional booth does. It cleans up your sin in that sense, but you have to deal with the temporal sin. According to Catholic theology, the church could offer people a way to clear that temporal sin through indulgences. This idea is justified in Scripture when Jesus says, "Whatever will be bound on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever shall be loosed on earth shall be loosed in heaven." The importance of indulgences stepped up in 1095 AD when Pope Urban, who wished to launch a crusade in the Middle East to take back the holy city of Jerusalem, because it was important for religious pilgrimage, declared that anyone who joined this crusade would receive a full plenary indulgence, meaning that all your temporal sins would be removed. In the past, pilgrims to Jerusalem would receive this indulgence, but the First Crusade is interesting because warfare is linked to the pilgriming act of receiving an indulgence. Over the centuries, the process of granting these indulgences started to expand. The Pope Boniface VIII added the Jubilee indulgence to pilgrims who came to Rome. This means that once every 100 years, those who came to Rome would receive a full indulgence and bypass purgatory after death. If you had committed a mortal sin and had not confessed, this doesn't get you out of hellfire, and this doesn't get someone who already died out of hellfire, but it could get someone else out of purgatory. That's at least the theological idea, although plenty of people misunderstood it. By the mid-1400s, the Jubilee indulgence was expanded by Pope Paul, who said that it didn't necessarily have to be performed in Rome, but it could be done by one's bishop, which caused indulgences to become decentralized. The use of military indulgences to fundraise stepped up when the threat of the Ottoman Turks on Italy and even the Vatican became apparent. In 1463, Pius II made a full indulgence available to anyone who would assist in rebuilding land walls in Hungary to fortify the Danube against the threat of the Ottoman invasion of southern Hungary, which they did conquer in the 1520s. Indulgences also became necessary in the 1400s for the Catholic Church to fund a new crusade against the Ottomans. The cost of these new indulgences was about a week's worth of salary. So as you can see, indulgences kick up in the Renaissance. And they weren't a medieval superstitious throwback. Renaissance logicians used humanist logic to argue for indulgences. They would invoke the Trojans and the Trojan War and use these ancient Greek and Homeric themes to justify the purchases of indulgences to fight against the Turks. And like I said, printing presses were used to produce them at this time. That's a reason why Martin Luther opposed Pope Leo X's offering of an indulgence to earn money in order to pay for the Basilica of Rome. By the time of Martin Luther, there are so many indulgences being circulated because it is the printing presses that are promulgating them. Well, the Catholic Church has argued historically that it didn't officially permit abuses of indulgences and the sales of them, even though there might be renegade priests who would personally profit from selling them. They would point to church councils that would issue statements against profiting from indulgences. For example, one council in England in 747 condemned those who imagined that they might atone for their crimes by substituting mercenary penitence, or thinking that they could sin as much as they want to and someone else would get an indulgence for them. The Fourth Council of the Lateran in 1215 decreed that indulgences should not be for more than a year, this being the limit observed by the Pope himself. The same restriction was enacted by the Council of Ravenna in 1317, and the Catholic Church claims that it tried quality control on who could issue indulgences. Boniface IX, writing to the Bishop of Ferrara in 1392, condemned the practice of certain clergy who falsely claimed they were authorized by the Pope to forgive all sorts of sins and exacted money from the quote-unquote simple-minded among the faithful by promising them perpetual happiness in this world and eternal glory in the next. When Henry, the Archbishop of Canterbury, attempted in 1420 to give a plenary indulgence in the form of the Roman Jubilee, he was reprimanded by Martin V, who characterized his action as unheard-of presumption and sacrilegious audacity. In 1450, Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, the apostolic legate to Germany, found some preachers asserting that indulgences released from the guilt of sin as well as from the punishment. Indulgences could free you from your temporal and your mortal sins. He apparently misunderstood the Latin in indulgences and was condemned at a council. Sixtus IV, in 1478, had to oversee a number of cases in which a number of indulgences would be issued because they were sold with the idea that it would allow for a sin to take place. So, Catholic Church teaching has argued that indulgences are not permission to commit a sin, nor a pardon of future sin, and it's not the forgiveness of the guilt of sin. It supposes that the sin has already been forgiven. And it's not an exemption from any law or duty, and doesn't confer immunity from temptation or remove the possibility of subsequent lapses into sin, but a more complete payment of the debt which the sinner owes to God. Least of all is an indulgence the purchase of a pardon, which secures the buyer's salvation or release the soul of another from purgatory. So that's what the church teaches, but the fact that council meetings constantly had to rebuke priests and clergy for selling them off to people or misusing them shows that the practice was widespread. In fact, somebody that we'll see later on in the series, who's probably one of the most successful seller of indulgences, was Johann Tetzel, who aggressively marketed indulgences in the early 1500s to try to fund a crusade against the Ottoman Turks. He came up with the famous phrase that said, "Every time a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs." The idea that if you have family members that probably led a sinful life, you could spring them from purgatory with enough money. He even made flowcharts showing how much each sin costs for an indulgence. If you confess sin for theft, it was this much money. For rape, it was this much more money. So with incidents like these, it became clear that indulgences had been far abused beyond whatever their original intentions were. A new Pope Pius canceled all financial attachments to indulgences in 1517. Indulgences haven't disappeared. They still exist today, although they aren't paid for in the same manner. In the Catholic Catechism, there are a number of acts that can still reduce time in purgatory or pay for temporal sin. Some of these actions include adoration of the sacrament for half an hour, visiting one of the patriarchal basilicas in Rome, or receiving a papal blessing. And the Centennial Jubilee still goes on. There was a Centennial Jubilee indulgence given in 2000 that was extended beyond the normal 8 days and stretched into 20. All right, so that is the practice of indulgences, but they really spring about in response to the First Crusade. And now I'd like to shift gears and talk about one of the most important groups that came out of the First Crusade, and that is the Knights Templar. A group I want to focus on is the Knights Templar that existed from 1119 to 1312. They came out of the times of the Crusades, a period which stories, songs, and epic poems were composed in huge numbers in the Middle Ages, because you had wealthy people going on crusades who brought their chroniclers in tow. And the Crusades are great fodder for books today like the Da Vinci Code, or, if you're a child of the 80s, your reference point would be Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. But the Knights Templar really stand out in the Crusades. The chainmail-clad Crusader paladin that wore a white mantle, sporting a giant red cross, had very distinctive clothing, and fashioned themselves as a highly trained warrior dedicated solely to God. And this is an image of the classic medieval Crusader. But there was also a lot of mystique to them, because some thought of them as a secret society that held the fortunes of Europe in its coffers, and with their financial dealings, they created the modern-day banking system, and became such a threat to the medieval Catholic Church that they were destroyed in one fell swoop. Later on, there were legends about them as guardians of the Holy Grail and other holy artifacts, and they became a source of intrigue and inspiration for everyone from scholars to writers. Now, legends about the Knights Templar are exaggerated. The Crusades were ultimately unsuccessful, and they were fought at great cost to all nations involved. But classic images and legendary deeds attributed to the Knights Templar have a solid basis in fact. The Knights Templar were a monastic order that was founded in Jerusalem in 1120, 21 years after the capture of Jerusalem by the First Crusade. The Knights Templar flourished for 200 years. The level of their power and influence ultimately brought them into conflict with monarchs, which led to their demise by a papal decree in 1312. But the order left its mark on the landscape of Europe even into the modern day. The origin of the Knights Templar comes from reports about Christian pilgrims to Jerusalem being harassed. Jerusalem had become dangerous and inhospitable to Christians visiting there and those permanently residing there. By the end of the 11th century, there was a growing desire to remedy the situation. This is what led to the First Crusade, where in 1095, Pope Urban II preached it, and Byzantine Emperor Alexius Comnenus issued a call for help after the Seljuk Empire conquered most of his domains in Anatolia in 1071 at the Battle of Manzikert. He sought help in reclaiming Byzantine lands in Asia Minor from Seljuk Turks, who conquered all this land up to the gates of Constantinople. So the Knights Templar, their official name were the Poor Knights of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, began in Jerusalem when a group of knights combined forces to protect laymen on pilgrimages to the Holy Land. Soon the order was simply known as the Knights